Welcome to this lecture introducing Machiavelli's The Prince, titled Playing Politics in Game of Thrones, an introduction to Machiavelli's The Prince. As the title of this lecture suggests, I'm going to talk about chess a little bit, but put a pin in most of my comments until we get to Thomas Malory, the Morte d'Arthur, because in his culture, late medieval England, in particular the late 15th century, chess comes to have a very specific cultural meaning, one relevant to the political climate of Game of Thrones. But of course, chess is a game played throughout the Middle Ages, and it even predates medieval Western European manifestations of it. In medievalist texts, modern adaptations of the Middle Ages or medieval literature, you will see chess pop up even in small ways in scenes, or to set a scene, or to show that politically attuned characters are engaging in some kind of war of thoughts or an actual hot war. It's used as allegorically to suggest anything where there's strategy and plays to be made. So as I have written there in the second bullet point, we have the trope, life is a chess game, because you have make all these moves. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. The Seventh Seal, if you're familiar with Ingmar Bergman's movie, which takes place in some kind of like loosely constructed Middle Ages. We're supposed to think it's follows the story of a knight who's fought in the Crusades in the 14th century. There are a lot of details about the movie that don't quite add up, but like Game of Thrones, he plays kind of liberally with the details in constructing a medieval world. But in a really famous scene, the protagonist, there on the right, plays a chess game with death, and this game is supposed to represent his impending mortality, and the fact that he's also gonna eventually die no matter what is one of the uplifting messages of this really good movie. In fact, in Game of Thrones, the absent presence of chess is clear from the series' title, so we know that George Martin and the producers, like of all of the different names they could have picked for the television series from the Song of Ice and Fire franchise, they pick Game of Thrones. But to know that chess is going to be one of the allegories governing the political world, let's look a little bit more closely at what makes it tick. Yeah, so if chess provides kind of a fantastic allegory for the world of Game of Thrones, there is a more hardball, real-world model for the political landscape of the show, something we can sink our teeth into in a more concrete way, and that is Machiavelli's The Prince, which George Martin cited as an influence on his literary franchise. So these pictures here are Rowling, a quote attributed to her, "It's hard killing off so many characters," and George Martin would respond in this hypothetical conversation, "You're adorable," because he himself has no problem doing this. If you watch the show long enough, you'll see this. And as a great person once said, it's a true story because it ends in death. I think that's the opening of that movie Brian song from many decades ago. Yeah, so you think about it, does that really add a certain gravity and veracity to a story by having key characters die? But it's pretty heartbreaking when you are attached to a fictional character, especially in Game of Thrones. Machiavellian has come to suggest, here's a quote from the introduction to your edition that we'll be reading, eschewing moral standards in favor of practical expedience, summed up with the catchphrase, "the ends justify the means." So George Martin has to kill off many of your favorite characters in order to advance the plot. Mercy for no one is maybe one way that that quote is exemplified. In our study of Machiavelli, though, we're going to take a closer look at his political philosophy and see how it's actually much more complicated than that. So it's usually probably the single word a person would associate with Machiavellian politics is a ruthlessness, but we'll see that the picture is much more finely tuned than that. Let's get a little bit of cultural context for The Prince, which is published in the early 16th century, but I'm going to think a bit more broadly about the culture from which it derived. So in particular, we're looking at Italy and some happenings that go down in Florence. So let's have a look at Florence, Italy. From the late 14th through the 16th century, Florence is known as the cradle of the Renaissance. The Italians excel in particular in all arenas of this cultural surge. So artistic forms, so you could probably name many Italian artists, even if you don't know the names of all the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Yeah, there you go. Michelangelo and Leonardo, Donatello, and Raphael. See, I did it. Literary texts. So at the very early end of that chronology, Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio, and scientific investigation. So, for example, human dissections, such as those performed by Vesalius, are really championed by the Italians earlier than in the rest of Western Europe. Let's have a look at one such beautiful piece of architecture that is built during the Italian Renaissance. So remember what I said about cathedrals, that it takes, often centuries to put them together. So the Florence Cathedral, there it is, the Duomo as it is known. And here we have those crazy kids from the Jersey Shore. And I'm from New Jersey, so I hate to malign my native state, but while watching the show, as I did religiously every single episode, one of the few television shows that I can say, yes, I saw every episode, I sat and quietly cringed, or maybe not so quietly, while watching them get drunk all over Florence, Italy, because I've not been, and it's just a cultural hotspot. So yeah, there we have the Duomo Cathedral, which is known as an architectural wonder, and I could show a million pictures of Florence. It is so beautiful, and granted, they weren't taken by my own camera. I guess you could befriend one of the kids from the Jersey Shore show if you really want to hear how wonderful it is. So there is a map of Italy with the Republic of Florence as it looked in the late 15th century. It is lit up in green. So this is the time and place in which the action relevant to the prince starts hottening up. But let's home in on what all that stuff I said about the Renaissance has to do with Machiavelli's story. On a cynical note, one might say that the cultural impulse behind these advances was the Florentines' preoccupation with conspicuous displays of wealth. So I'm not so sure exactly how that would be manifest with the literary text, like perhaps having a poet perform at court, for example, would be a sign of prestige for a royal person. For sure with the arts, I think you can imagine how that would be attractive to wealthy benefactors such as the Medicis, who are one of the most powerful families in all of human history, recorded history, that is. They make their money via banks, and thus they have the monetary power to promote the arts, and it also helps them found a political dynasty. So from about the early 15th century, I'd say for about 3 centuries after that, there's always a Medici in some sort of enormous position of power in this region. So, for example, from the Medici family, we have three popes come in the 16th and 17th century. So I didn't include their names here and their dates, but yeah, they were pretty tightly bunched together. So you think within the ambit of about 100 years, you have three members of your family get a very, very, very powerful office. So, wow, and it's not like, the papal seat is a hereditary one, so that's pretty unbelievable. And as I say here, they are often on the top 10 lists on BuzzFeed or what have you. Popular sources will always have them there on the list, and even if there's lists of super duper corrupt political families, yeah, the Medicis are always a pretty easy target, and I guess for good reason. So where does Machiavelli fit into this scheme? In 1434, the Medicis gained governance of Florence, so Cosimo de' Medici had been exiled by the previous ruling family, but for about a century, the Medicis had been accruing local power due to their banking business. About 60 years later, the Medicis are expelled, and then we have two popularly elected leaders in the next 16 years that they do not fare very well, as you can imagine. There are forces that don't want them to be in power. They're kind of swimming upstream. Machiavelli is a senior official in the Republic from the years 1498 to 1512, so for the entire length of its endurance. He's appointed to an office of the second chancery, so that is a late medieval word for a place where documents are produced, although his role entailed other functions, as you will see. So here are some more particulars relevant to Machiavelli's career, and you can, with his being in charge of the chancery, I think that we can see how that influences his writing of the Prince, in that there's a certain element to that text where the person in power has to control the spin, as it were, the production of truth with a capital T. But for 3 years, he's responsible in particular for the militia, which does see a fair measure of success under his reign. So here's one example of that. So they defeat Pisa, so both the city and the city-state that implies. However, in 1512, so just 16 years after the Medicis are kicked out, they are backed by the Pope in charge to defeat the Florentines, and that republic is dissolved. So that small queue of popularly elected leaders, that reign has now come to an end. And Machiavelli is fired from his job and accused of conspiracy, imprisoned and tortured, but yeah, ultimately he's found innocent of these charges, but goes on to write The Prince, which is maybe in a sense something of an expose about his stint in Italian politics. So it's thought that the most immediate source for The Prince, you'll see these Medici characters pop in and out of the text because it is full of many, many, many examples. So a totally different text than Gerald of Wales's, but kind of example driven in many parts of it, which I think is helpful. On the one hand, we may not know each and every one of these characters, but on the other, it puts a really tangible face on what he's talking about. So yeah, Machiavelli is perhaps speaking in particular about the state-building methods of Cesare Borgia and his father, who was Pope Alexander VI. So no, the exclamation point is not an official part of his name, but you could really fall down a rabbit hole researching the Borgias, who like themselves are a powerful and, dare I say, corrupt political family. Pope Alexander, for example, admits to fathering not just Cesare, but many children, but he's also a rather effective pope. And for example, he authorizes, like, either for good or for ill, European expansion to the quote unquote New World. So that's if you look at like the years in which he died, yeah, we have Christopher Columbus's quote unquote expedition to the New World takes place under his during his reign. So yeah, a lot to be said about that political family. And Cesare, yeah, one final thing, he dies in battle and is deposed in 1507 at the age of 31, and is wearing some kind of mask that is thought to cover up the fact that parts of his face have fallen off due to syphilis, and he's otherwise completely naked except for a red tile covering up his genitals. I'm not making this up. So just these ruling families in this time and place, yeah, we can really see how the prince would inspire George Martin. And then, although I don't know that he's drawing on any of them in particular, yeah, they are just so saucy and so corrupt, and truth is indeed stranger than fiction. Okay, enough of that little digression about Cesare and his sordid manner of death. These two try to bring part of central Italy under their possession under the pretext of defending church interests, but you know, as their careers might suggest, that church and state affairs are inextricably wedded in this time and place. And I'm going to talk more about how Machiavelli resists a certain type of church and state marriage that is current in medieval and even early modern culture. So Machiavelli is writing in a long and established tradition known as mirrors for princes. I had hoped that that shape looked something like a mirror, a genre of political writing associated with the Middle Ages and Renaissance, although there are classical models on which these later texts were drawn. They are, quote unquote, self-help books addressed directly to kings and rulers. Maybe a little bit strange, like, why a mirror? So this is a pretty common convention in the Middle Ages in particular. So the text as a mirror, the word being speculum, so you can see in that word like spectator or spectacle, associated with words involving looking in present-day English. This is a common trope in the Middle Ages. So if you think about the function of a book, you maybe read a book to discover something about yourself, or conversely, to discover yourself in the textual matter there. Machiavelli's The Prince was an innovative text at the time, so let's think about why that might be. For starters, it is written in vernacular Italian rather than Latin, so of course those two languages would have been closer than, say, present-day English and Latin, but it is a bold choice indeed. So only somewhat recently, in the last 200 years, when Dante used vernacular Italian for his literary compositions, was the language really exalted to the level of Latin. So at this time and place, many educated people knew Latin. So if you wanted your text to have a pan-European readership, you might opt to write it in Latin. So additionally, in English, in analogous tradition, the late 14th century, we see Geoffrey Chaucer and other contemporary writers choosing to write in the vernacular rather than other available options. Yeah, he's writing in the mirror for princes genre, and the reason that he is innovative and, you know, doesn't just copy the tradition but puts a bit of a twist on it, as I say here, unlike preceding works, it is oblivious to Christian values, which at the time made the text controversial. So if we think, yeah, we have a pope who somewhat recently, Alexander VI sired Cesare Borgia, who was a secular leader. Like, gee, it seems like church and state affairs are pretty well mixed in. We have the Medicis from their family, maybe not through illegitimate births, but put three popes on the throne who obviously are going to serve their political interests. So that's not really how Machiavelli prizes apart church and secular affairs. What he criticizes is the traditional relationship between morality and authority. So let me home in on this idea. In the medieval model of the mirror for princes, even if the ruler were a complete jerk, so someone like Joffrey is on the throne, let's say, we are supposed to imagine them somehow as a vehicle for divine power. So maybe, and I don't know how this works on the level of individual consciences, but you'd maybe think, gee, I am some kind of divine vehicle. Maybe I will try to be a good ruler by being a good person. So kind of guilt tripping you into doing the right thing. Alternatively, you could imagine someone thinking, yeah, I am divinely ordained, and that would turn you into a complete sociopath, thinking you were like a little deity who could do whatever the heck you wanted. So to get back to my earlier point about Machiavelli, he is popularly associated with the credo, the ends justify the means. So we might think that many politicians subscribe to this idea, and even in our individual lives, if you think, oh, I'll do anything to pass that class, even if it means cheating, and then if you get an A in the class, you think, well, the ends justify the means. Cheating was obviously the right thing to do. What he really meant, so granted, our translation he wrote in his own vernacular, but the text is translated into present day English for us. What he really meant was more like, when devising the means, consider the end. And so that's a little bit of a different philosophy. So yes, it still is very practical minded. You're not just doing something to occupy yourself, or because it makes other people happy, or just because it's part of your routine, or maybe it'll get you some kind of divine favor. I mean, it's definitely kind of a very world embracing philosophy still. The way that I think about it is in terms of Bobby Fischer, the chess genius's plan to play a chess game. So he alleged, and I don't have his exact words, but he alleged to have the entire game, all the moves figured out before moving a single piece. So he'd read his opponent and know about his opponent, and think about every single move he was going to make. So it still implies, if not a really high level of ruthlessness, a super high level of calculation. So you ask then, what code of conduct does govern Machiavelli's advice book? So I'm going to talk now about three key words: power, and I'll pronounce it virtue, but I mean something very specific by that, and fortuna. So Machiavelli on power. So here are a few very basic tenets of his notion of power that will become more developed as you read The Prince, and then we can see how the Game of Thrones universe squares with these ideas. The only real concern of the political ruler is the acquisition and maintenance of power. So you think like the public good does not really factor into that. So really what a strange idea, but call me a cynic. It seems like a lot of politicians today on both sides of the aisle, like, I feel like they really do just want to like get elected, to like get to sit in a fancy chair, right? Or get to wear fancy clothes and have a corner office and tell people what to do. Which brings me to the next blurb on this slide. Authority and power are essentially equivalent. So the getting to tell people to do stuff, that is the benefit of power. So you need others to be subservient to you in order to really manifest your power. Goodness and legitimate rights are not sufficient to win and maintain political office. So you need to maintain your power. And so if you're wondering, gee, this is all great, I would love to be powerful, how do I go about doing this? Read Machiavelli's The Prince, and you will get quite an education in that. But just being, popular, or, good to the people and getting elected, or improving things, or having a big heart, like a lot of qualities many of us would want to see in a politician, would not be sufficient. You'd get eaten alive in Machiavelli's world. And then also just, you get the throne, let's say, because it's yours, because your dad had it. He's going to argue that no, you also need to have networks operating in your favor. So again, this gets complicated. The last one there, I save the best for last. There's no moral basis on which to judge the difference between legitimate and illegitimate uses of power. So it's just like, if you accomplish what you set out to accomplish, that was a legitimate use of power. So there's no good or bad use of power per se, as many of us would imagine it. It's more like effective versus ineffective uses of power. Virtue. So, as I say here, this perhaps best captures Machiavelli's vision of power politics. The Italian word would translate into English, its cognate form would be virtue, which would connote moral goodness. So the type of goodness that optimally you would expect from a ruler in the Middle Ages, as they have an obligation for being some kind of vehicle for divine power here on earth. But unexpectedly, not. Machiavelli means something different. So virtue, the range of personal qualities that the prince will find it necessary to acquire in order to maintain his state and to achieve great things, the two standard markers of power for him. So getting stuff done and being effective and having practical results are manifestations of his power, and underlying that is the personal quality of virtue. So do we want to say that it's kind of like a get her done kind of quality that resides within the ruler? In this case, I'll usually say he, because we're talking about, quote unquote, the prince, but of course I could mean she or they, and any ruler. The examples that Machiavelli has in mind are male, almost exclusively, I think. Yes, so what does virtue exactly mean? It connotes pride and bravery, strength, and a certain amount of ruthlessness. So I think that all of those things are accommodated by the get her done ethic that I noted on the previous slide. So if we think of what the word vir or vir means in Latin, it is the word for man. An associated word is virile. So if you say that man is very virile, usually you'd be like, oh, they can lift a lot of weight at the gym, and they get up at 5 in the morning and jog 10 miles or something. Like, it implies, like, yes, it is sexist, but it does imply a certain energy, and even a youthfulness, I'd say, and a liveliness. So virtue is not how we would recognize it, although in the word virtue, we would imagine, in order in the Middle Ages to be virtuous, it wouldn't be like, oh, I have to be manly, but you would have to actively be cultivating your very best self to refrain from engaging in vices. And so that's how virtue and that energy that bubbles up within your belly, that's how it would apply to people of quote unquote both sexes. Here are some shorthands for the word virtue as Machiavelli means it. Here for us Southerners, grit, or for those of us raised in the Northeast, the word chutzpah, which means really more like nerviness, but I couldn't resist because I do think it's a relevant term. It's hard to define, and I do in fact have a dog named Chutzpah who maybe doesn't look very vibrant or energetic there, but she does look, rather smug and as if she could wield some serious power, which she often does. So perhaps my favorite of the three ideas that Machiavelli accounts for in his notion of statehood is fortuna. So we probably see in there the word fortune, and we usually think that that connotes good fortune, unless you say unfortunate, in which case it's bad. For Machiavelli, fortuna is the enemy of political order, the ultimate threat to the safety and security of the state. It is a malevolent force and the source of human misery, because while on the one hand it may be responsible for human success, no one can act effectively when directly opposed by fortuna. So I picture it as like an X factor or a chaos. Unexpected things belong under the rubric of fortuna. So yeah, fortuna can operate on your side, but it's also, that rock stuck in your shoe or the shoelace broken at the last minute when you don't have a chance to switch it up. And this aspect of fortuna is suggested here in this wheel and made popular on the game show Wheel of Fortune. So you think, the point there is to accrue money, and usually people are win the money, but you can know the solution to the puzzle and get all the letters and not have to buy any vowels, and you just randomly lose it because the wheel has spun and it hits the bankrupt slot. So the notion of fortune as being kind of random and up and down and not something to be trusted is current throughout the Middle Ages, and it in fact is emblematized in the Wheel of Fortune, a la the game show that I mentioned earlier. So it is made popular by Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, a 6th century Latin text, in which fortune is described as a fickle goddess who is the source of human good as well as evil things. So in the previous slide, Fortuna was a lady who was standing to the side of the wheel, and she's spinning it with a stick, and she herself is blind. So here we have, let's look at the randomness that this wheel offers. At the very top, we've got a king sitting, recognizable by his crown. There's his crown. And right there in Latin it says regno, I reign. And there, I wouldn't expect you to be able to see it, but what it conventionally says is regnavi, I reigned. And you can see his crown falling off his head. It would be cute were it not so sad. At the bottom, what this says is sum sine regno, I am without reign. So it seems like the crown has left the building entirely at that point, and this poor person is being ground by the Wheel of Fortune. And so the point is that, he probably didn't do anything per se. He just spun the wheel and he hit that bankrupt slot, even though he had the trip to Acapulco and the car and $10,000, and he knew the solution to the puzzle. It's like, too bad, Galahad, thus says Fortune. And this hopeful person over here says, Regnabo, at the 9 o'clock position, I will reign. So, as we can see, all of those figures are, royal ones, or people who are on the throne and ascending to it or aspiring to it. So it's thought that fortune goes after particularly successful people. So it's like, they lead the lifestyle of the rich and famous, but that makes this force of fortune want to mess with them all the more. So as you may have noted there at the bottom of the last slide, I said that that image was from the Carmina Burana manuscript written down in the 11th or 12th century in Germany, but the songs are all in Latin, and Carmina means songs, and Burana means like literally like of the country or the like the wilderness, so that it implies that they're folksy or rustic. But you perhaps know one of them because it was famously set to music by Karl Orff, and hopefully this slide will play okay and you will recognize the song O Fortuna. So yeah, the words accompany that image that you saw on the previous page, but not set to this musical composition. And I won't bore you with telling you what all the Latin words are. You can look those up. Just listen to this, enjoy, put it on your iPod and take it jogging with you.